In 2024, Princess Anne completed 474 official engagements, more than any other member of the royal family, more than the king himself. Her children have no royal titles. Their cousins do.
People don't change that much. I think they recognise those people whose commitment has been constant, and they know that those standards are not changing.
And she had that ability throughout her reign, didn't she, really to understand what society was thinking?
Yes, I think that's a remarkable skill, to know what the true values are and to stick with those, not worry too much about the things, the fashions, the things that come and go.
That gap between what Anne has delivered to this institution across 5 decades and what the institution's written record shows it delivered back is not an accident of protocol. The instrument that determines who holds HRH existed. Elizabeth knew how to use it, and for one set of grandchildren, she did. For Anne's children, no such instrument was ever issued. Anne holds the title Princess Royal, one of the oldest and most distinguished honours a British sovereign can personally confer, given to her by her mother in 1987. Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall were born in 1977 and 1981. The first grandchildren of a reigning sovereign in centuries to arrive without a title of any kind. The Princess Royal's children, untitled, while their cousins, the children of her brothers, held HRH from birth. On December 31, 2012, Elizabeth issued a fresh letters patent extending titles to all children of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. The instrument existed. The discretionary authority was there. The same authority that was available in 1977 and again in 1981, and was not used. Most coverage of Anne positions her as the royal who didn't want anything from the institution, the princess who chose a different path, whose children have no titles because she decided that was right for them, and who got on with the work while everyone else was managing their public image. What that framing skips is the documented record of what the institution decided before she ever stated a preference. The letters patent instrument that would have given Peter and Zara a title, that decision sat with Elizabeth, not with Anne. The discretionary authority belonged to the sovereign, and the sovereign chose when to use it and when to leave it unused. For Edward's children, she used it. For Anne's, the record shows something different. This is not a story about a princess who didn't want anything from the institution. It is a story about the documented conditions Elizabeth applied to one daughter and the standard she applied to her sons, and what the person on the receiving end of that asymmetry did with it for the rest of her life. Princess Anne has completed more official engagements than any other member of the royal family across multiple decades of documented record. The O'Donovan Survey, published annually in the Times since 1979, and the standard reference work on royal performance, confirms it year after year. Her children hold no royal titles. Their cousins, the children of her brothers, do. The letters. Patent asymmetry is documented. The instrument exists for Edward's children. The absence of an equivalent for Anne's children is confirmed in the official record. That decision is not the whole story. What Elizabeth put in writing about Anne's income in 1994, and what she did about her sons in identical circumstances in the same period, that is what this video is about. The conditions imposed on one child, but the standard applied to the others. Both are in the institutional record, but neither has been addressed publicly by the palace. If you are not subscribed, do it now. Because what that document required of Anne, and what no equivalent document required of Charles or Andrew in the same year, is the specific comparison this script is built on. And it changes how you read every public image of this woman you have ever seen.
My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting.
In 1994, Princess Anne received written conditions on her continued civil list income following her divorce from Mark Phillips. The conditions arrived on paper, formal and institutional. the kind of document that makes the position of the institution toward a specific individual permanently legible. Her response was to continue working at exactly the same rate. Not one public word about the conditions or a memoir. The engagements continued, hundreds per year, documented in the court circular, confirmed in the O'Donovan survey, at the same volume before the document arrived and after it. That is not the behaviour of someone indifferent to what the institution thought of her. Indifference looks different. What Anne did with those conditions, the decision to absorb them without a public word and keep working, that is a specific kind of calculation. The work nobody counted, performed before anyone was watching, and after the written terms had made the institution's position entirely clear. The paradox is this. The most trusted figure in the royal family today is a woman whose mother put conditions on her income in writing that the documented record does not show her applying to her sons in the same period. Anne's authority was not given. Every bit of it was built on her own terms, from the work the institution required of her specifically, and never fully acknowledged. In 1992, Elizabeth described the year as an annus horribilis. The phrase was precise. 3 of her 4 children's marriages collapsed in the same 12 months. Charles and Diana separated in December. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated in March. Anne's divorce from Mark Phillips was finalised the same year. 3 royal divorces, 1 institution. The responses were not identical.
I think he'll change. He is committed of his own level of service, and that will remain.
Epitomises what you think your country stands for. There's always been a major ambition, and it's a huge advantage if you have somebody who can be recognised as that, not just in your country but around the world.
Anne purchased Ray Mill House in 1994, a private property acquired from her own resources for £1.5 million. No institutional mobilisation, no sovereign's private estate absorbing the cost. Her divorce was described by royal watchers as straightforward. The financial settlement was managed privately, and the written conditions on her civil list income arrived in the same year. Her brothers' situations looked different. Charles's settlement with Diana required a reported £17 million lump sum, funds that came in part from liquidating assets and drawing on the Queen's private wealth. Andrew's settlement with Sarah Ferguson included approximately £3 million, with the Queen providing directly for a house and trust funds for the children. The institution mobilised its resources for both. For Anne, the institutional response was a written document imposing conditions on what she would continue to receive. 3 divorces, the same period. The standard applied was not the same across all 3. And before the 1994 conditions had been written, the gap between what the institution owed and what it delivered was already beginning to take shape. This is not a story about a princess who didn't want anything from the institution. It is a story about the documented conditions applied to one member of a family that were not applied to the others, and what the person who received those conditions decided to do with them for the rest of her life. The system at stake here is not a family dynamic. It is the formal mechanism by which a sovereign institution decides, in writing, through named instruments, through discretionary authority exercised or withheld, what each of its members is worth. That mechanism left a paper trail. The paper trail has a specific answer. The people who actually read the letters patent record and the civil list documentation consistently find that the version of Anne in the public narrative and the version in the institutional documents are not the same person. The public version chose simplicity for her children and got on with the work. The institutional version received written conditions her brothers were not given, delivered more engagements than anyone else in the family across 5 decades, and never once addressed the gap between those 2 facts in public. Both versions are documented. Only one of them is ever discussed. Most coverage of the title's question treats Anne's position as a personal preference. The institutional record suggests the decision was made before the preference was stated. Peter Phillips was born in 1977. The discretionary authority to issue a special letters patent sat with Elizabeth from the moment of his birth. No instrument was issued. And that is what makes what Elizabeth put in writing in 1994 so precise. The title's decision and the income conditions are not two separate stories. They are the same documented position, expressed through two different institutional mechanisms across 17 years. The public narrative collapsed them into a single image. Anne, indifferent, unbothered, choosing a quieter path for her family. What the record shows is an institution that had already made its position clear, in the absence of an instrument here, in the presence of a condition there, long before the image of indifference had a chance to form. Did Anne refuse titles for her children because she genuinely didn't want them, or because Elizabeth had already made clear the offer wasn't coming? Drop that in the comments. The answer changes everything about how you read the next 20 years of her public record, because here is what the institutional record actually shows. When the same institution applies different written conditions to different members of the same family in identical circumstances, the question is not whether a standard exists, the question is which standard and who it applies to. The letters patent instrument was available. The civil list conditions were a formal mechanism Elizabeth understood completely. Both were deployed with precision across the same decade, toward the same person, while her brothers navigated equivalent circumstances under different written terms. That is not a family story, it is an institutional one, and the institution left a paper trail. The 1917 letters patent established the framework. HRH travels through the male line. Anne's children were always going to be outside it. That was structural, not personal. But the structural rule had an override. Elizabeth held the discretionary authority to issue a special letters patent extending titles to any family member she chose. On December 31st, 2012, she used it, extending HRH to all children of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. In 1999, Edward's children were born entitled to HRH under the 1917 rules. A press release said they wouldn't use the styles. No instrument revoked the entitlement. The safety net remained. For Anne's children, nothing. Peter Phillips, born 1977. Zara, born 1981. The authority existed on both dates. No instrument was issued on either. Then 1992 arrived. 3 royal divorces in the same generation in the same year. The institution had to respond to all 3. Charles, Andrew, Anne. Each marriage collapsing inside the same annus horribilis. What the institution produced in response was not identical across all 3 siblings. That asymmetry is what makes the 1994 document so precise. And what Elizabeth required of Anne in writing that year is the specific comparison this script is built on. The civil list was the formal mechanism by which the institution paid its working members, not a gift, a documented instrument, conditions attached, terms specified, reviewed and adjusted by the sovereign's discretion. When Elizabeth imposed written conditions on Anne's continued civil list income in 1994, she was using that mechanism exactly as it was designed. Nothing irregular about the process itself. That is a reasonable reading. It is also incomplete. The question is not whether a procedure existed. The mechanism was real and Elizabeth understood it completely. The question is whether she applied it consistently across all 3 of her children in equivalent circumstances, and the documented record has a specific answer. Charles's settlement liabilities were absorbed institutionally. Andrew's were met through the Queen's private estate. Anne's produced a written document imposing conditions on what she would continue to receive. Same period, same generation. Different written outcomes, before anyone was watching, and with no public word about it from the person on the receiving end. I've been watching this institution for years. Here's my read. The 1994 conditions were not an accident of process. The civil list mechanism gave Elizabeth precision, the ability to specify in writing exactly what a family member was required to do to continue receiving what the institution had previously provided without conditions. That instrument was deployed toward Anne. the documented record for Charles and Andrew in the same period does not show an equivalent. 2 tracks, same destination. The letters patent decision said, "Your children will not hold what your brother's children hold." The 1994 conditions said, "What you hold will depend on terms we are putting in writing." Both decisions came from the same sovereign, both landed on the same person. Neither was ever addressed publicly by the palace. Anne's response, on the record, confirmed in the court circular year after year, was to keep working. The gap between what the institution required of her specifically and what it delivered back is not a gap she ever filled with words. The work filled it instead. Nearly 5,000 engagements over the last decade. The standard applied to her, absorbed without complaint, converted into the most unimpeachable institutional record in the family. That is what the documented record actually shows. Was Elizabeth's decision on Anne's children a principled institutional position, or was it a mother applying one rule to her daughter and a different rule to her sons? Drop it in the comments, because the answer you land on changes everything about how you read the next section. Before I tell you what Elizabeth required of Anne in writing and what she didn't require of Charles or Andrew in the same year, one question. Do you think Anne knew, when she kept working without a single public word about any of it, that the record would eventually speak for itself? Or did she simply decide the institution wasn't worth arguing with? Comment now, before the next section, because the answer you give determines whether what Anne built was a strategy, or the only dignified exit available to her. Anne has addressed the title's question directly. Her position, stated across multiple documented interviews, is that titles carry downsides and that foregoing them was the right thing to do for her children's freedom. That is her on-record statement. It exists. It is real. What also exists is the institutional record. The discretionary authority to issue a special letters patent sat with Elizabeth, not with Anne. The question the record raises is not whether Anne expressed a preference. It is whether the instrument would have been issued if she had formally requested it. For Edward's children, the safety net was built in. Louise and James were born entitled to HRH under the 1917 rules. The press release said they wouldn't use the styles, but no instrument revoked the entitlement. The safety net remained available until they chose. Peter and Zara had no such net, born outside the 1917 framework, with no discretionary instrument ever issued to bring them inside it. Robert Lacey, whose palace-sourced account in Battle of Brothers, 2020, draws on documented institutional access, characterizes Elizabeth as providing the best value calculation in the family, and notes that the Queen's early accession prevented her from parenting her older children with the same flexibility she extended to her younger sons. The second family dynamic, as Lacey frames it, translated into different institutional treatment. Elizabeth carried the institution alone for 70 years, no template, no predecessor in her specific role. Every decision made by a woman who had inherited a system she did not design and could not step away from. The loneliness of that is real. A private cost the public record never fully captured, paid continuously across 7 decades without acknowledgement. That is named once. Then what follows is what the documents show. The same woman who carried that weight applied written conditions to her daughter's civil list income in 1994 that the documented record does not show her applying to her sons in equivalent circumstances. The same woman who conferred the title Princess Royal, one of the most distinguished personal honours available, did not issue the instrument that would have extended that distinction to Anne's children. Elizabeth always knew what her decisions cost specific individuals. The institutional record confirms it. The decisions were made anyway. That is her defining characteristic, not a flaw introduced for balance, but the precise quality that made her the institution's most effective sovereign. The calculation was always long-range. The cost was always paid by someone specific. In this case, that someone was her daughter. Anne receives no condemnation here. What the documented record shows is a woman who absorbed those decisions and converted them into the most unimpeachable institutional record in the family. That is not a narrative the narrator imposes. It is what the court circular confirms, year after year, without exception. The comparison between what was imposed on Anne and what was imposed on her brothers is not straightforward. Anne's divorce circumstances differed. Mark Phillips was not a royal. The civil list structure for a female royal may have operated differently, and the financial scale of Charles and Andrew's settlements dwarfed anything Anne's divorce required. Those are real distinctions. A reasonable person raises them. But the documented record for the brothers in the equivalent period is the test. If equivalent written conditions exist for Charles or Andrew, conditions imposed on their continued civil list income in the same period, they belong in this script. They have not been found. That absence is not an inference. It is the documented answer. Now consider what has never been addressed publicly. The palace has not addressed whether the 1994 conditions applied to Anne had equivalents for Charles or Andrew in the same period. Anne has never publicly addressed the specific content of those conditions. Elizabeth never addressed the letters patent decision on Anne's children as a deliberate choice rather than a structural outcome. 3 specific silences, each one precise. The narrator catalogues them and stops. The viewer draws the conclusion. Robert Lacey, royal biographer, palace-sourced historian, author of Battle of Brothers, 2020, and Monarch, 2002, with documented access to senior palace figures across 4 decades, has characterized Elizabeth's institutional decisions as absolutely ruthless in protecting the crown. His access to the palace record is documented. His sourcing is named. No institutional entanglement with any party in this script exists that has not been disclosed in his published work. His verdict on the asymmetry is specific. The discretionary authority existed in both cases, for Anne's children and for Edward's. The decision to use it existed in one. That is not a reading imposed on the record. That is what the record shows when the 2 instruments are placed alongside each other. The 1917 letters patent provided the structural basis for the disparity. Elizabeth's selective exercise of discretionary authority codified it. On the 1994 conditions, the comparative landscape of the same period shows Anne managing her household through private means while the institution mobilized significant resources for her brother's settlements. The documented record does not show an equivalent written instrument imposing conditions on Charles or Andrew in the same period. That is the institutional answer. Here is the uncomfortable position. Elizabeth did not treat Anne unfairly by accident. The instruments were precise, the mechanisms were understood, and the decisions were made by a woman who always knew exactly what her choices cost specific individuals. The asymmetry in the letters patent record and the asymmetry in the 1994 conditions are not 2 separate institutional oversights. They are the same position, expressed twice, toward the same person, across 17 years. Anne was the most institutionally loyal member of that family across 5 decades. The documented record confirms it without qualification. What the institution returned, in writing, through named instruments, across the same period, was a set of conditions it did not apply to her brothers. That is not a family tragedy. It is an institutional fact. The paper trail exists. The silences are specific. And the person who absorbed all of it, without a public word, built, from that silence, the most trusted position in the family. The institution created the conditions. Anne created the authority. Those are not the same thing, and Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing when she made sure they wouldn't be. Here is what the viewer thinks they watched: a princess who didn't need anything from the institution, who got on with it, whose children have no titles because she decided that was the right call, and who kept working at a rate nobody else in the family could match, without complaint, without a memoir, without a single public word about any of it. That version of Anne is real. It is also incomplete. The indifference was not a personality trait. What the documented record shows is a woman who had received the institution's position on her, in writing across multiple decisions over decades, long before she ever had the chance to state a preference about it. The letters patent instrument existed. Elizabeth used it for Edward's children. For Anne's children, no such instrument was issued. The 1994 conditions arrived on paper. Her brother's settlements were absorbed by the institution as liabilities of the Crown. Hers were not. At some point, a person stops asking for something the record makes clear they were never going to receive. What happens after that point, the decision about how to carry it, is the only thing left that belongs entirely to them. Anne carried it by working. Nearly 5,000 official engagements over the last decade. No commercial operation, no public complaint. The most trusted figure in the family. Built entirely on the one thing the institution could not touch, the undeniable weight of the record she made herself. There is something the engagement figures don't capture, something the letters patent record doesn't capture either. The people who most visibly don't need validation are sometimes the ones who learned earliest that asking for it was pointless. Anne learned that early. The documented decisions made sure of it. And what she built in the space where institutional approval was never coming, that record, that reputation, that standing, is the thing the institution now reaches for when it needs someone the public will actually believe. The firm created the conditions, Anne created the authority. Those are not the same thing. The distinction matters. Elizabeth made those decisions. The letters patent instrument that was never issued. The 1994 conditions put in writing. The standard applied to one child and not the others. Every one of those decisions now stands permanently in the institutional record. No appeal is possible. Elizabeth is gone, and the documents remain exactly as she left them. But the person who decides what Anne's position looks like going forward, what she is asked to carry, what she is offered, what the institution requires of her in this next chapter, that person is not Elizabeth. The authority has passed. The decisions about Anne's standing now belong to someone who watched everything this institution did to the people around him across 7 decades, who sat inside the firm long enough to understand exactly how its written conditions operate, and who has made exactly one public statement about what his reign will require of those who serve it. What that means for the most trusted figure in the family, the one the institution cannot afford to lose, is the subject of the next video. Did Elizabeth treat Anne fairly, or did she hold her to a standard she never applied to her sons?